So we're going to go in the middle of נימוקי Yosef, the bottom left of the page Ches. So what? So the last we had is נימוקי Yosef introduced us to a way of thinking about the Hamshech Gemoro, when the Gemara introduces the first case of Rav Nachman, where a person is putting light beams on his neighbor's wall, and whether or not he has a chazaka for the larger beams, and halacha is that he does. However, the girsa is, we saw in the Rashi different girsais, whether Rav Yosef and Rav Nachman are arguing, whether Rav Nachman l'chatchila is saying it. Either way, the halacha remains that you have a chazaka to put the thinner beams, you have the chazaka for the stronger beams. Whereas till נימוקי Yosef, it was a question of, did that chazaka come right away by lack of protest? Was that chazaka come 3 years later? But everybody agreed that it was disconnected from the preceding discussion. And נימוקי Yosef says quite simply that it's a continuation. What the chazaka we're talking about here is to indicate that you have a chazaka that you paid for it. Because even if you only put light beams up there, you have a chazaka for bigger beams because you paid for that part of the wall. And therefore, the Mishnah which said about the ames that are above 4 ames, then having beams up there is a raya nasan, even if they're only thin beams, because that indicates that you have chazaka for the whole thing, because you must have paid for it. And that's the continuation. And then the Gemara goes on a sidetrack with other chazakas from Rav Nachman about rain falling and a person who's renting an apartment. And then the Gemara comes back, it would seem, in Ravina, about the person who puts the beams for shade, 30 days, sukkahs, and then if you put cement, it happens right away. Which again, we'll get to his comment about that today. So now the נימוקי Yosef tells us Yesh Mefarshim, others that learn it differently, and this goes back to the Rosh. Right, the Rosh. So like this, Yesh Mefarshim are those that explain the Had or the second class, the column on the left. Yeah, you saw it. The Had or the Kashuri. This question of thinner beams and heavier beams, lighter beams and heavier beams, who dumya de natvi v'shufchi, is similar to the question of a person who has a chazaka for a slow drip and is trying to claim a chazaka for a bigger flow, right? Putting a drain pipe to make the flow denser, bigger. Shohumi tam, and this comes as a result of chazaka gimel shanim, a 3-year chazaka. But tanis mechir matana, and this too comes along with someone who makes the claim that the person sold it or bought, or I bought it, or you gifted me the rights to that. So this is like the Rosh, which says that the case of Rav Nachman, the person who's putting up beams, it's a question of whether when a person has a chazaka for thin beams, he also gets a chazaka for thicker beams. It's a question of the person having it there for 3 years, and because it was there for 3 years, it must own some part of the wall, or at least it paid for half the wall, unrelated to the case of the previous Mishnah, just a new case. And all the cases there are a question of 3 years until we come back to the question of Ravina, in which case we revert back to the original case of the Mishnah. That was Tosafos, now was the Rosh. Just that the Tosafos said the chazaka comes right away because of lack of protest, whereas the Rosh said it's 3-year chazaka. Yeah, so here's introducing us to the Rosh's opinion. Now, yeah, from Tomar, if this is the case, that when you have a chazaka for thin beams, lighter beams, after 3 years, you also have a chazaka for heavier beams because you certainly must own the rights to the wall itself, not just to the usage, and therefore the usage is limited to what you took it for. But you actually have the rights for the full usage. I shouldn't say that, but even if you have whatever the rights are, the point is you have the rights to the full rights, whether it's full rights of usage or full ownership. Either way, the question becomes, how could we say that a person has a chazaka for the thinner beams also has a chazaka for heavier beams? The Gemara teaches us in Bava Mitzvah, and this is a contradiction that the Rosh himself brought up, but here gives a different answer than the Rosh gives. So Elyon Habal Shanes B'Shikmim, I'm not sure if I pronounce it. A person who wants to change the floorboards, wants to change the beams that are holding up his top. He's in the top floor and he has the split property. The guy has one person owns the top floor, the other person owns the bottom floor, and the guy on the top wants to change his floorboards to sycamore. Shaiman loy, we let him do so because they're lighter beams. If he decides to change to cedar, we don't let him. This seems to contradict. Seemingly he has a chazaka already to use the beams. He's been living up there, and yet we don't allow him to increase the weight of his floor. So why over here with the wall do we allow him to increase the weight of his wall of his beams when the Chori only had rights chazaka for thin beams? Why are we allowing him to increase it and put heavier beams? So the Rashi's answer was that it's a question of whether you bought it together or if you built it together. If you bought it together and this is the way you bought it, and you can't change it because that's how you bought it. But if together you built a structure, and it just so happens that you put sycamore till now, you can still put cedar because when you built it, you built it in such, the split is that I can do whatever I want on the top floor. But when you buy it in a certain way, then you're stuck and grandfathered into the way it is right now. That was the Rashi's way of explaining the two Gemaras. But here he gives a different answer, two different answers. Answer one, Tira said, Ivad gives an answer. The Hasam Aidi, there in the case of the neighbors who live on top of each other, the Makam Shmakpidin, that's in a place where the custom is people are scrupulous about increasing the weight on their house. But over here, Makam Shein Makpidin, where people aren't scrupulous about it. So it's the simplest. I shouldn't use this word, but it's a pasha to answer. It doesn't really answer the stira so much as it tells you the different circumstances. It doesn't change. It doesn't give us any new insight into din. The Rosh gives us a new insight into din. The din is if your grandfather in, you stuck the way it is. If you built it together, you can increase your chazak. But the Rabbi is just saying the two different scenarios without any new insight into din. Right?
Well, it's the same. It's not much different than the Rashi.
I don't actually. It's not really because the Rabbi is saying it's totally in kapeda, which means we're not assuming you bought the rights to the wall. It's a question of, is the owner okay with it, right? Whereas the Rosh is saying, you bought the rights to the wall. So if you bought the rights to the wall, you bought it completely. But when you bought a house, you didn't buy rights to do whatever you want with the house. You bought the house as is, right? For the Rosh, it's a question of what rights do you own. Whereas the Rabbi, it's a question of kapeda.
No, the makam shemak. It's not the.
Okay, so not the individual kapeda, but the kapeda of the community.
But that creates a din. That in some
communities,
so.
Yeah, it creates a din that you're subject to the custom. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Okay, so he says Teda, and you should know Sha'inyan Talib Minug, that indeed this is a question of custom. The Tanya B'Tosafos is learned in Tosafos, but Mitzia, bias le'echad, v'aliyah le'echad, if one person owns the main floor and somebody else owns the second floor. But also b'aliyah livnois yoita agabo, and the guy on the second floor wanted to build a third floor. Yoita means a floor agabo above him. So Mokum Shlogo Lasei Shtayim Misholish Oisa, in a place where the custom is that people build 2-3 stories, he's allowed to. So you see, the ownership of the top floor is dependent on local custom. So if the local custom is that you may increase the weight of your floorboards, and you may. Okay. So that's answer number 2. Answer 1 from the Rosh, answer 2 Ravid, and now answer 3. Others answer the Hachikama. That when our Gemara says that a person who has the rights to put lighter beams on a wall also automatically has the rights to heavier beams on the wall, that is, if a person has the rights to 10 smaller beams, then he has the chazaka for 5 heavier beams, that they are in weight equal. And therefore, idach, and if the other person cannot, protest. We see the
same.
We saw a similar thing in the נימוקי Yosef earlier. I thought it was a similar thing, but I don't think that's what he was saying. Right. Even though the other guy might protest because the weight is more concentrated, because the weight's equal, he cannot protest. Now, it doesn't mean that he could protest it because the weight's. That's what he's saying at the end. And the other person cannot protest by saying that the weight is now too concentrated. Since the weight is equal, he's allowed to, which changes the entire thing completely. Which means in this scenario, you're definitely not buying the rights to ownership. you're buying the rights to wait.
Right.
It's not usage.
By a certain right of use.
Yes, but in other words, if it's just exclusively usage, then we cannot increase your usage whatsoever.
Mhm.
But here it's a question of the weight of your usage. Okay, so you can redistribute the weight, however fashion you want, but you still don't own the wall itself. Whereas the Rosh is saying you actually own the wall, and thus you can build whatever you want. And the Rabbi is saying you're subject to local custom, whether you can increase in your chazak or not.
Mhm.
Okay. Now he's going to make a statement, which to my mind, changes is different from the Rosh. Now, those are the latter generation have agreed, relative to his generation, which would be the Shonim for us, that the person only has a chazaka, only for the usage of this actual wall, so long as it's standing. But if the wall fell, he lost his rights to using. Why? He owns nothing of the actual wall, which is not what the Rosh said. The Rosh said you specifically do own part of the wall, which is why when the wall falls, you take half the stone. Right. In the Rosh's view, he's saying. So in other words, it seems like what he's saying is no matter how you touch, maybe that's why he didn't go to the Rosh's answer. He didn't want to give into this notion that you actually own part of the wall. Either you're subject to custom, or you only have the usage of weight distribution. And the question is, right? He didn't want to acknowledge this idea that you own part of the wall, because if he did, then he wouldn't have this haskama from all the achronim. That would be others who disagree, right? You're going to make this universal statement that you only have the rights in that wall, and that means you can't own anything. You only own usage, and your usage you only own for this wall. Once the wall is rebuilt, my strength is different, and I may not relinquish usage to you. It's a new structure. I may not sell it to you.
Doesn't it contradict the whole idea that נימוקי Yosef connects this to the
preceding? Yeah. So that's why you have to go with this. That the Hiskimu Achronim. Okay, that's a good question. Maybe the Hiskimu Achronim is only an extension to the Yesh Mefarshim, not to the previous one, right? Because last week the first paragraph said that, and now we say Yesh Mefarshim that's unrelated. Yeah. That this is a 3-year chazak. So maybe the Hiskimu Achronim is only talking about that. It actually has to be. Yeah. It's talking about, otherwise the whole thing doesn't flow. Yeah. You're right. Yeah, you're right. So maybe he would take the Rosh and put it into his previous explanation, even though the Rosh doesn't connect it to the previous Gemara, but in Havana and Din, it's really the same. Even though the Rosh doesn't technically apply the case of the thinner beams and the thicker beams to the previous Gemara, but in Havana, it's the same Din. You own part of the wall. Mm-hmm. So I guess you're right. The Hiskimu Achronim is dafka only in the previous way of understanding. It's a question of 3-year chazaka. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good point. So, so if the wall fell over chaskasa, he lost his chazaka. He owns nothing of the actual wall. Not in the real estate, not in the place of the ground upon which the wall stands. He doesn't own anything of the stones, which the Rosh definitively said you definitely own the stone. Now, af in Bava Tainus Mechira, even if the guy comes and says you sold it to me, because the Lo'ilam, Lo'ilam means like forever or always. Nemo, we are going to say, they only sold him, he only sold him the right to use these beams. Now, when is it true that you can claim that I only sold you the rights to usage, but not to the actual wall, and therefore if the wall fell, you don't get to use it again. If the wall fell and rebuilt it, you don't get to use it again. This is only true if he never put up a roof and cement, as would be the custom of one who's using his own wall. But if his chazaka is such that he built a roof there and put cement, and he comes and says, look, you sold me the right, so you gifted to me. He has a chazaka even in the actual wall. Why is that? Because if not, if you can still tie that, even after there's cement and a roof, the other guy can still tie that, only give you the usage and you abused your rights, How is it ever possible for someone to acquire chazaka in owning the actual wall if roof and cement doesn't work? And we must say that there's a possibility for such a chazaka. Why? Because if we're going to require him to hold this contract, we learned about Basra and up to 3 years, a person is careful to keep a copy of his contract. Beyond 3 years, a person is not careful to keep his contract, which is why he has a chazaka for 3 years. So we cannot hold someone who buys half a wall liable to hold a contract for 3 years forever. At one point, he has to be able to rely on chazaka. Now, if having stam beams there is only chazaka for usage, then when does a person get chazaka for ownership? So we must therefore say that when he does something that indicates he owns it, namely puts a roof with cement, then he taka owns it for 3 years. The Amram therefore must work with the chazaka as we mentioned, which is with cement and roofing, and that's what Rabbi Yonah Zecher Tzaddik Kadosh Livracha has said. Okay. Omar Machaber, just translating the word Maziva, Pish Maziva Yazdi Shishlayim, Meluchas Masim Malakayos. These are sorry. Omar Machaber, Pish Maziva. What's the meaning of the word Maziva, which is a roof? Meaning it comes from the word V'yazvu Yerushalayim. I don't know the pasuk, but it seems like they put an aziva to Yerushalayim. And these are luchais. Luchais means boards. Hamasim malakayos that you put onto crossbeams, oikonim or sticks. It's tzroiros and stone or pebbles. As is the custom in each location. Some malita, shmoy malita b'lashon arami, and in Aramaic it's called malita. Min utmantem b'malat, quoting from a pasuk again using this word. Okay, adkan. Just translating the word maziva, which means basically a roof or floorboards if you're looking from the top down. Okay. Now the next case in the Gemara is the case of the guy who rents an apartment. And again, נימוקי Yosef just runs through for us, gives us a little recap. One who rents a home to his friend, the bira, in a big bira, he has the rights to use the wall around the apartment that he rented. So Pirish bira, what's a bira? That is a big structure. It has many rooms. So it's a big building with many small rooms. And a person rents out one of these rooms, or a person who rents out one of these rooms, he can use the wall that's opposite to his room, the dalad amis, extending 4 amis outside of his actual room. Then bezizin, whether we're talking about zizin means like hooks or like pegs. That are coming out of the wall, whether the windows or holes in the wall, Shiur, whatever there might be there. If the person rented the top floor, and he has rights to use the width, the top of the wall, which he has access to, considering that he has the roof. Where the custom is that the owners of the top floor get to use that space on top of the wall, so he gets to use it too. And the local custom is that people are not concerned with somebody using that space. So if the owners use the top of the wall, then the person who rents it also gets that right. The dalad amas again extending 4 amas outside of his apartment. Now, the koisel bira, not just the wall of his apartment, that's in front of the entrance to the apartment, so the front yard. Sorry, not just the wall that's protruding to the front around his room, but even the wall that's in the garden in the front of the house, he's allowed to use. And even the wall that's in the backyard, he's allowed to use because his apartment is open to the front and back, and he gets to make usage of it. Okay, so that's a recap in the Gemara. Now we come to the final point in the Gemara. And the final point in the Gemara is the case of Ravina, which is a person who put beams for shade. And Ravina gave 3 cases. If he puts beam for shade in 30 days with no protest, he has a chazaka. If he puts it up beams for a sukkah, then as soon as sukkah is over and it's still there, no protest, chazaka. If he puts it up with cement, then chazaka right away. Okay. So pligi bi perusha rabusa. Big machlekes in this explanation, in the meaning of this. Rabbi Tosafos, the rabbis of France, I suppose that means Rashi and the Rashbam, the Rabbeinu Tam, and you can see in the parentheses it says Tosafos the Ramaskal Hai, the Rashba, Savri, they are of the opinion, the Ein Chazaka, that a Chazaka would never work, Dafka only if, Begimel Shana if you have 3 years. You must have, we'll go back to the Tosafos and see how he learned Tosafos different than what I did.
Mhm.
Now, but at least different than I thought to begin with. So the Rashba, Rashi, Rashbam, Rabbi Tam, Savri, the Ein Chazaka, there's a little dal there, it should say Ella. The Ein Chazaka Ella, Dafka Begimel Shana. One cannot acquire the rights to someone else's wall unless he spends 3 years, unless he has used it for 3 years. Bava Tanas Chazaka, and he comes with a taina that it was bought, that he bought it or was given him as a gift or something like that. As is the rule in Cheskes Abatim, that kol chazaka she'ein matayna, that every chazaka must have a claim with it. Right? We learned this before, that a person can't just say, my claim is that I've used it for 3 years. The person has to make the claim that I bought it, and it's been 3 years and I don't have my contract anymore. But without that, ein a chazaka, it's not a chazaka. B'cheskes gimel shonim ayri. And there, the Gemara in Cheskes Abatim is referring to a 3-year contract, a 3-year chazaka. Umashman, the implication from the Gemara there is, look, the klolahu, that's a cloud. The whole cheskes sh'ba'olam, any chazaka must come with 3 years. Now, if Rabbi Tam, Rashba, Rashi all agree that a chazaka takes 3 years to use, well, we don't see it in Rashi, but it's, I don't know what he means by Rabbanan Tzvarfas, but if it takes 3 years to get, so then what's the case of Ravina that after 30 days you have a chazaka? Therefore, therefore they explain this chazaka of the case over here where Ravina says that a person has a beam for shade. He gets a chazaka right away. The koya masnisan, it's referring to our Mishnah. Now, when the Mishnah says that a person who built extra height above 4 amas, the other person is becheska shalei nasan ashiyaviraya shanasan, right? So that is the main by this means to say the kivin shesasak lai hala, because the other guy was quiet. Lismach ba'oisek kaiso. Hi, Kashura, let's say, because the other guy was quiet when I put up my beams on your wall for shade. And that is chazaka that I gave the money. But over here, we are not talking about a universal chazaka, because they all agree that universal chazaka takes only 3 years, which is an interesting way of learning Rabbeinu Tam. Because the way we understood Rabbeinu Tam was that Rabbeinu Tam is going in line with certainly the Rashbam, who said that there's an idea of chazaka by lack of protest. And that's what all these cases were, chazaka, lack of protest. Right? In Cheskes Abatim, it says it takes 3 years. So the Rashbam told us that over there, 3 years only is a question of karka. And over here, it's not a question of karka. Over here, it's a question of chazaka of usage. The Rosh said it's a chazaka of, not karka, but at least it's chazaka of owning half the wall, and that's why it takes 3 years. But Rashbam, and Tosafos was just saying that it's a chazaka of usage, so that happens right away. That's how we understood the Gemara till now. Why do I understand it this way? Because we'll go back to the Tosafos. Because the third Tosafos on Bava days. But the chazakas, all the chazakas mentioned earlier, the rain drip, the guy putting up the beams, the light beams, and therefore getting a chazaka for the tile beams. And this Rabbi Shmuel is probably the Rashbam, who is the same author of the Tosafos that's in the Rashi. Now, I assumed that this Rashbam is the same thing as Tosafos, as the first Tosafos, which is Rabbeinu Tam. And therefore, I assumed that Rabbeinu Tam is saying that B'chlal our Gemara is not talking about a 3-year chazaka, because 3-year chazaka is reserved for karka. And here it's a question of usage. Now, the only time you have a chazaka right away, even though you don't have 3 years on karka, well, it's still. Okay, you still have to go with what the נימוקי is saying. Let's just play out the נימוקי Yosef. It's better. Let's look at the Tosafos. I'm Rabbeinu Tam. The Masistim Koi. The Arsh Loishim Yoim Lehav Chazaka. V'hav b'cheskes shleinosim v'kam ve'elach av b'cheskes shemnosan. V'asisharpa denok dehachav le b'cheskes abatim. Right. So the נימוקי Yosef is saying the reason why Tosafos is putting this here is to tell you Because Cheskas Batim gives you a universal din that you need 3 years. And here it's saying it only takes 30 days. Why? Because it's connected to our Mishnah. You already own part of the land. But in essence, you would need 3 years. You have no other way of getting chazakah unless it's 3 years other than this case. See, but who? Okay. Even though Rashi didn't say that. What did Rashi say? Rashi did not say that. Rashi said, says Rashi. He put the beams up on his friend's wall. I'm not talking about the wall of our Mishnah, which is split anyway. So Rashi therefore must be limited to the usage, not to owning anything. Right? And maybe that's taka because otherwise you need 3 years. Right? So, but it's not mamish clear. In other words, he's saying two things here. They all agree that it takes 3 years universally. And because it takes 3 years universally, over here, they're connecting it back to our Mishnah. But Rashi doesn't connect it back to our Mishnah. He just says it's talking about usage. Right? So that's where the נימוקי Yosef is not representing, at least from what we understand, the Rashi and Rashbam so directly. But let's see how he compares it to the other people. Okay, so this is one camp, said the נימוקי Yosef. One camp is, I think the period goes after this word hacha. I think that's where he switches to the other opinion. So one opinion is that a chazakah takes 3 years universally. And furthermore, it seems in the נימוקי Yosef that this is going with the opinions mentioned before, the Yesh Mefarshim, that the previous chazakahs also take 3 years. And the only reason why this chazakah doesn't take 3 years is because you already own the bottom part of the wall. But the chazakah of the drip would take you 3 years. The chazakah of the thin beams, or the thick beams, also would take you 3 years. That's what it seems like from this נימוקי Yosef, which is that part's not consistent with Rashi, Rashbam, and even Rabbi Tam is not consistent precisely. Although maybe it is. It's the same. Maybe it is consistent with Rabbi Tam. Maybe Rabbi Tam and Rabbi Shmuel quoted in the Tosafos are two different opinions. Rabbi Tam would say that this Ravina is going back to our Mishnah, but everything else till now is 3 year chazakas. But Rabbi Shmuel is saying it's not 3 year chazakas. Maybe, but Tosafos is not clear. There's a machlekes here. Tosafos doesn't say it. Rabbi Tam says that we're talking about 3 year chazakas until we get to Ravina. Whereas Rashbam says it's instantaneous chazakas for lack of protest. Tosafos doesn't make that split, but he seems to be doing that. He seems to be learning in Rabbi Tam that the previous things are also 3 year chazakas, which is not clear from the way we learn, the way we see Tosafos and the Rashbam and the Rashbam. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if I'm clear. Follow what I'm saying? No? Okay. He's putting a whole bunch of people in the same camp. Ibn Tam, Rashi, and the main point he wants to make is that universally you need 3 year chazakas. Okay. And our Gemara is an exception. The case of Ravina, where the person gets the chazakah after 30 days, right, where the person gets a chazakah right away. Right. Why is it an exception? Because it's talking about our Mishnah, where the person is talking about our Mishnah, where the guy built 4 walls 50-50, 4 almas 50-50, and the other part is higher. And that's why the chazakah happens right away. It doesn't need 3 years.
What he's saying on the first.
That's right, but now he's talking about the third case, the last case.
Right, but conceptually it flows.
Yes,
well.
But how does he? But if he's learning now like this, that is talking about that Ravina is going back to our Mishnah, then how would he be learning in the previous cases? In the case of the rain, and the case of the neighbor, and the case of the thin beams and the thick beams, he seems to be saying that all these people agree that universally you have to have 3 years. This is the exception because you already own the bottom half of the wall. But everything else is 3 years. Right. And that's how he's learning in Rabbi Tam also. Okay. Right? Rabbi Tam didn't say it explicitly. That all Rabbi Tam said was that the case of Ravina was back to our Mishnah. Okay, but Rabbi Shmuel, sorry, yeah. But Chachmei Tzarfas, who seems to be right, the Rashbam, and Rashi, that's right. They talk, maybe they agree that universally you need 3 years. But Rashbam wrote explicitly that the 3 years is limited to karka. But over here, you're only acquiring usage, and acquiring usage is right when there's no protest.
He says that explicitly.
Yeah, look at the Tosafos that's inside of Rashi on Vav Mad Aleph. Kol chazakas halalo d'shmaitin, ein chazakas shalosh shonim. All these things are not shalosh shonim. The rain, the thin beams, and the thick beams are not 3 years. All of them. The loy shai shalosh shonim ela gabe cheskes karka, where you were trying to acquire land. But over here, it's a question of usage. The time mishum the loy shavik in l'sham shebetech shaloi. Right? And likewise, go to Vav Medbeis, Tosis, v'yichav b'tzina la'alter. V'oin Rabbeinu Shmuel, that's the Rashbam. The chazakas le'il, all these chazakas up until now, lav shaloshonim, el la'alter. Kedamin and hacha, just like we see over here by the case of Ravina. So the Rashbam and Rashi do not connect Ravina to our Gemara. They just say all these cases are a question of usage and therefore happens right away, or 30 days, whatever. Whereas the book of Yosef is lumping them all into one category because universally you need 30 days, as if to say you need 3 years, as if to say the case of rain also needs 3 years, and the case of thin beams and thick beams also needs 3 years. It's only the case of Ravina that doesn't need 3 years because you already own the bottom half because it's our Mishnah. So that's what I'm saying. The way נימוקי Yosef is learning in these, if I'm getting it right, because he says about Tom
Is he lumping them all that way? Is he lumping?
So maybe he's only lumping them together in terms of the 3-year condition for universally. But that's not so universal according to Rashbam and Rashi, because it doesn't apply to usage. According to Rosh, 3 years is a universal rule.
Yeah.
Right? A genuine universal rule. Not according to Rashbam.
Or is he just lumping the issue of ownership into 3 years? And
okay, maybe.
And so then, but he needs to make a distinction here because he's saying, okay, you could learn. The other guys are saying that even this last case, they're also dealing with the question of ownership, but the reason they say it's not 3 years, it's immediately and this and this and that, is because you already own them all.
That's what seems to be saying, yeah. But Rashi doesn't learn that this last case is connected to our Mishnah.
Right. Straight
up does not say that. It says Kaisel Chaveda, not Kaisel.
Sure. That I know.
Right. Okay, but let's see how he contrasts it to the other opinion, right? Because he said at the beginning, pligi b'pirusha rabusa. So let's see the other side. Now I think the period goes over here after the word hacha, fourth last line on the right side, right column. Now a Perek layachber, later in the Gemara, in our Gemara Chav Gimel, gabe v'hara chizikolohu, and likewise b'cheskes abatim with respect to elot dvarim sheish lehem chazak l'cholim. So kosum in Gaonim, it's written in the name of the Gaonim. Sheyesh chazaka, there are some chazakas she'ein tzricha shalosh shanim. It does not need 3 years. So long as the damage is revealed, and there's no protest, there's a chazaka. So what exactly is this? Is this the chazaka of usage? Is this a chazaka of ownership? I'm not clear, but it's this new gather of chazaka where everybody sees that I'm damaging what you're doing and you're not protesting. Now, and this is like our case, the other guy is not losing any property. In other words, the chazaka of cheskes abatim is where I'm using your field for 3 years. So you're definitely losing out on your ownership of your property. Over here, I'm resting things on the top of your wall. You're losing karka. I'm not ruining anything. You can move my beams tomorrow and use it. I'm not ruining anything in your field. Right? Elanezek, but there is a damage because I'm stealing from you. The key mention is gala hazek, and because the damage is exposed, you see my beams up there on your wall. And you did not protest. Macham, you relinquished the right. You forgave it. So it's not about chazaka sheyeshim matayna. So this is not either like the Rashbam that we had. The Rashbam that we had is, he said, even though it's not a 3-year chazaka, it still needs a chazaka she'in matayna. But this is not saying chazaka she'in matayna. It's chazaka v'chazah mechila. Because you saw the nezek and you didn't stop the nezek, you forgave it. And machma zeh chazaka. And not because of a claim of sale, right? Because if I'm arguing that I bought the right, that can't be the case. The imkenk is if so, namely, then the owner of the wall should tell me, bring your contract of sale. Because we learned that a person holds on to a contract for 3 years. The kol shekain shleishim, how much more so 30 days? So this is a new gather. So one gather chazaka was chazaka of usage. And maybe Taka, this is why he lumps the Rashi and Rabbi Tam into this same gather, because Rabbi Tam, Rashi, and everybody else all agree that chazaka any chazaka of ownership must take 30 years. This case is different because it's chazaka of usage, or according to Rabbi Tam, this is different because you already own the bottom. But now we're getting a new gather in chazaka of ownership, not by tanis mechira, because tanis mechira would mean bring your contract. But by your lack of protest and not lack of protest, it's more than that. It's, I am damaging your property and you're not protesting the damage, means you forgave it. And thus I have ownership. Even if I have no time, even if I don't say you sold it to me. I don't claim you sold it. So this is a new gather.
I would always presume that it's like Rashi kind of, that it's case of Faveda, that it's not on the property line, right?
Yeah. So I'm saying, that's why I'm saying that
Because if it was on the property line, then it would fall in with the first.
Going back to the Mishnah's case.
To the Mishnah's case, in the same way we said with the heavy sticks and the light sticks.
The way נימוקי Yosef initially said in the first case, yeah.
And so it can't be on the property line.
Yeah.
So it's case of Faveda like Rashi.
Yeah. So that's what I think. The נימוקי Yosef is dividing these two camps, not a question of how you touch the Gemara, but how they learn in Din. However you touch our Gemara, Rashba, Rashi, Tosafos, Rabbi Tam, and even to some degree the Rosh, all agree that chazaka of karka, or let's rephrase that, chazaka of ownership must take 3 years. Chazaka of usage instantaneously. Now the question is, what exactly is the last case of Arvina? Is that a chazaka of usage and therefore takes 30 days, or is it a chazaka of ownership and therefore you must connect it back to the original Gemara where you already own half the bottom, right? But they all agree on the premises of chazaka, however they touch the Gemara. Where now we're getting a new gedder and chazaka. But there's not a chazaka based on the fact that you sold it to me. That would take 3 years. Chazaka of ownership can come by. Let me say it again. They all agree, even the Rosh agrees, that chazaka of ownership must take 3 years. And to avoid that issue, the Rashbam says that drooping rain is only a chazaka of usage to evade the issue of 3 years, because in principle he agrees that you require 3 years to get ownership. Whereas the Rosh says we don't avoid it, we just say it's a 3 year chazaka. But they agree with principle on din, that if you're going to talk about ownership, you need 3 years. If you talk about usage, you don't need 3 years. I don't know, maybe the Rosh says you need 3 years for usage also. I don't think so, because he went on to say that you even own part of the bricks. Right, so it's not the ownership of the karka, but at least it's ownership of the bricks. Whereas the Rashbam said it's ownership of karka. Okay, so you're splitting hairs. But chazaka of ownership requires 3 years. And that's one camp, no matter how you touch the Gemara. The other camp is that you can get a chazaka of ownership not by 3 years, when there's revealed damage and you don't protest.
Presume that you own it.
Then you're a meichel. And my chazaka doesn't come with time and mechira.
But the mechila, at least the presumption that you own it.
Not that you sold it necessarily. I own it because of your mechila. It's your mechila that makes me own it. It's not a king that happened earlier. Look at this. A chazaka of gimel shonim
is that what it is?
Yes.
Or the mechila
reveals the chazaka.
Reveals a chazaka. You don't need that 3 years.
Chazaka of gimel shonim and chazaka of tashmish reveals you sold it to me, which means the kinyan happened way earlier. But if you hear you saying the kinyan happens in your mechila,
right? That's why I said, because otherwise you could just say, "Hey,
exactly." Like he says here, the matmazeh b'hachazaka. So this is a new gedden. I think that's why he's splitting it. Even though Rosh, Rabbi Tam, Rashi, Rashba, they may learn the Gemara very differently, but they all agree on this principle that there's only 2 ways to get chazaka. If it's tashmish, it's instantaneously by lack of protest. If it's only a question of tashmish, it's a question of actual ownership of assets, owning the stone, owning the ground, must take 3 years. We have a case of Avina where the guy's getting chazaka of 30 days. One of 2 explanations. Either it's going back to the Gemara where you already own half the bottom, or it's only a chazaka of usage. But the Goyim are saying a new gedder and chazaka. Another gedder and chazaka.
Mechila, by being meichel, he's granting you a property right.
That's right. Oh, is he granting you ownership or is he granting you usage? I'm going to say he's granting you usage. Because otherwise you're going back to the same point that made in the previous case of Rashi and everybody else. I'm going to say he's granting you ownership.
Ownership or usage?
Ownership. If there's hefsid karka, then it changes. If there's hefsid karka, then it takes 3 years for you to acquire it because you've done too much. Why isn't there mechila there? Why isn't the mechila there? It's very schwer to me. Anyway, look at the bottom, the last line on the right side on the top of the thing. There's no loss to the actual property. Lidach to the guy who owns it. There's only damage coming here. Because the hezek is revealed, the beams are there. He didn't protest. Machal, the owner was moichel. He forgave it. Because of that forgiveness, there's a chazaka. So why does he say she'in by hefsid karka? Because if there's hefsid karka, then what? That's when you need 3 years. Because what's the case with cheskes abatim? Is it only because the guy says you sold it, that's why he has to wait for 3 years? What if I come and said, you never sold it to me, but you were moichel. Look, I've been damaging your property for the last year and you didn't say anything. Then because I didn't claim sale, therefore I now have a worse chazaka?
Yeah.
It wouldn't sound right. Unless you must say, because you're doing such an audacious ask, we're going to make you wait 3 years to prove that you bought it. But if it's not so audacious, it's just some sort of damage. And here's the key also. Shenigla hezek, the hezek is revealed. It means to say, we have to know for certain that the owner knows about it. Because if the owner's out of town, then we can't say that nigla hezek.
But why would they give him ownership? That's the issue.
Because you're moichel.
No, but
because it's negligible. That's the point. Because it's negligible. If
so
your mom is ruining my whole,
let's say the wall falls after that.
he doesn't get to use it again.
Does he get half the stones, half the value of the
Does
stones?
he get half the stones? You're right. It would be very hard pressed to say he gets half the stones. So he's moichel the usage.
I mean, if
then if that's the case, then the previous opinion must say that usage also takes 3 years. Otherwise, must not like it's between the first opinion, between the Goinim and the previous opinions. What's the machlekes between the first opinions and the second opinions in the quoted here in the נימוקי Yosef? Unless the machlekes is whether or not you need a taina with the chazaka. That's the only distinction. What would be the distinction between this Goinim and the guy acquiring usage in Rashi's case of the rain? What's the chiluk? The chiluk is only a semantic, whether you got it from a chila or maybe that's what it is, if you have a taina or not with it. But נימוקי Yosef doesn't say that. The נימוקי Yosef stresses dafke begil moshanim uba b'tainas chazaka, and therefore has to have a chazaka with she'eini v'tama in a chazaka and dafke gimel shanim, right? Because then the machlekes if he's just getting usage.
Yeah.
Machlekes becomes a semantic. Is he moichel? Is he getting it because of mechila, or is he getting it because tainas mechila? With the Jews, it's not semantic. It's a question of din also, but it narrows the machlekes, and it's not in the words of the נימוקי Yosef. נימוקי Yosef seems to be making a machlekes and how you actually get the chazaka. And I assume it's a chazaka of ownership, because that's a good question. According to the Goinim, if the wall, according to the נימוקי Yosef types of the Goinim, the wall falls, does the guy get half the thing just because the guy's moichel when I put the things up on the top of the roof? That's pretty harsh. You're a nice guy, you let me put beams.
that are damaging my wall on top of it.
Yeah, and you're moichel, okay, because you're a nice guy, you let me put the beams there. Now the beams fall, I get to own half of it. Sounds like Quebec law.
Unless somehow the mechila is an indication of a purchase.
Then they go to bring your star. He says no, because the ilu mitam mechira yevshe. If it's a question of mechira, bring your star, says the guy. It's a very, very strange, interesting gather. Okay, let's conclude this the נימוקי Yosef, and tomorrow we'll go to the Mora Gadol Muhammad Hashem. So let's conclude this. Now because
maybe talk about mechila. It's possible mechila of the usage. It could be mechila of the usage versus a mechila of the usage.
He doesn't. I don't know. No, actually, it's quite clear that they're going to talk about ownership or usage, because he said that where's the Goinim coming from? They're coming to cheskes abatim, and there in cheskes abatim, we definitely talk about ownership. And like Abay that, the Goinim say that there are some chazakas that don't require 3 years, and that's the chazaka where there's no hefsid. Because if there's a hefsid, it's so audacious, you have to have some real thing. If it's major hefsid to the karka, it's not negligible. So my mechil is not enough for you to own it. But if it's just a nezek that isn't causing a hefsid, then it's negligible, and maybe I am moichel, and you own it. It's quite a heavy chazaka. Okay. Now, if the Goinim said there's been a get to Mechila that happens right away, how much more so if the person had those beams up for 30 days? And therefore, we say the Labasa Tlasin after 30 days, up to 30 days, a person is scrupulous. After 30 days, a person is like, gets annoyed. Why is your beam still up there? Even because this person didn't care, Machal, he forgave it. And because he forgave it, therefore, the guy has ownership of half the wall. That's what it seems like. Now, Veskimu Imam Harav Yosef Alevi B'Megash, that Megash agreed, but Ramban agreed. Okay, so now we come to I see they put it in the footnote that Rashi and Rashbam and Maram are along with this. Goinim, but it doesn't seem like that to me. For me, it seems like certainly the Rashba, certainly the Tosafos added in the Rashi here says you have to have chazaka with a taina. No. Even Rashi says that I have to come along with a taina that I paid you off. It doesn't say it comes with no taina. It says it comes with a taina of mechira. Anyway. Okay, so the Rebbe Megash and Ramban agree. Now Hilchach, therefore, so it says in נימוקי, how to paskin. Neda be'ina, it seems to me, shedavar shakel. We're stuck in a it's equal. Yeah, we have like equal scale. And therefore, nearly it seems to me loymar to say that a person who has the chazaka of these beams, oy ben nezek, or some other damage ki high, just like this one, hichzik is machzik, without a hefzik. When we're quiet, and we allow him the chaskase in his chazaka, we don't do anything, we don't touch it, because we have no choice. But if we were to go and actively remove the wall and take away his chazaka, we would be like a moitzi mechavera. We, the bezdin, would be like extrapolating rights from the sky, and the burden of proof is on us, and we have no proof because we're in doubt. Right? How can we do that? We as the bezdin are in doubt as to what the halacha is with the guy who has his beam up there, and if we have to leave it, because I'm not sure where it stands.
I'm sure it stands, so you can status quo.
Yeah, but not because I think it's right, but because we can't do anything about it. As opposed to Rashi, who says it's totally right that he's there. The guy bought. Oh, you know what? Let's do it this way.
So it's chazaka or no chazaka, or because.
Let me put it this way. If let's go to Rashi, right? Go to Rashi on Bava with days, right? Lo have a chazaka. This is up to 30 days, no chazaka. Yeah, you see the Rashi? Vav mit beis, lo have a chazaka. Yeah. If you put the beams on his friend's wall, so it's his friend's wall, it's not the wall that belongs to both of them. Now, and the friend did not protest within 30 days. Lo have a chazaka, there's no chazaka. No chazaka for what? They're going to have stopped here. Without a protest, there's no chazaka. Because it's not 30 days yet. After 30 days, you have a chazaka because of lack of protest. But Rashi says, what kind of chazaka? Litter and v'lemer, to time and say, I paid you off. Ad olam, forever, I paid you off to own it forever. But the chol tos mem lo hikbet inish, v'le machi. Right? Because he says, my friend needs it for their thing. But Rashi adds those things that the chazaka is a chazaka to be able to claim that I paid you off. Now, what happens if my beams have been up there? It's now 40 days. You'd have him protest. Now you come to me and tell me take it off. And I say to you, you're moichel to me. I never bought it from you, but you're moichel. Where does Rashi stand on that? I'm not timing that I bought it. If I timed I bought it, Rashi would say, look, you didn't protest. This guy's timing he bought it. Chazaka she'ima taina, he keeps it. But what if I didn't say that? What if I just say, look, you were moichel?
That's not a reason to keep it.
It's not a reason to keep it, but like נימוקי Yosef saying, that's when נימוקי Yosef comes in. It's a doubt situation. I don't know where to go. Because you're right, like Rashi says, you have no taina, no chazaka. Chazaka without taina is nothing. Or right, but the Goinim say that the mechila itself is a kinyan. And because I'm stuck, I'm going to leave it there. Following? Okay, final comment from
Only
okay,
just
sorry.
because basically, it's because there's two opinions. And
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can't contradict one, you contradict the other.
Yeah.
So because we don't know, then it's status quo.
Yeah. What's
But
the practical difference?
The footer, Rashi himself would say you take it down.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm a little bit dumbfounded by the little vav there that tells us that Rashi agrees with this. After the parenthesis where it says Muhammad is a small vav. Ramban Zal, little vav, go to the right side, Hagoyis Hatsunim, there's a vav. V'chein Rashi v'Rashbam. Maybe you have to look in Daf Mem Aleph from the Aleph to see it. You have to look at the Rambam also. What this Mechila is business. Okay.
Right, because Rashi's comment here doesn't exclude that case, it just doesn't include it.
That's why I was asking.
Yeah.
In Rashi's opinion, Rashi uses the language of Mechila, which is similar to the Goyim, but it's a Mechila for the sake of Chazaka that a person can claim I paid.
Right.
And what if I didn't claim I paid? What if I said you were Moichel? You were, it's been 40 days. But is that enough?
It's not.
It seems like it's not.
Exclude it, but
Doesn't-
it
but it's
seems
enough.
like it's not.
So does that mean Rashi would default to this נימוקי Yosef also, say, look, I have nothing to do, leave it there? Doesn't seem right. Right? Anyway. Okay, let's do the last comment on נימוקי Yosef. Now, of the mitzvah, if the guy put up the shade for the mitzvah of sukkah, the Hainu is to say sukkah at Shiva Yemen, if he puts up a sukkah leaning his sukkah against the wall of his friend, up to 7 days, we'll have a chazaka, there's no chazaka. Because the owner of the wall knows the mishum mitzvah to ka avid la, the avid. He's doing it for the sake of the mitzvah, mishum chazaka, not because he wants to acquire the ownership. Ladaf Shiva doesn't mean literally only 7 days. The same thing is true, meaning for the 8th day, which is Chag Atzeres, which is Shmini Atzeres and Simchat Torah. Because he can't take it down on Yom Tov. And listen to the Kronak at the verse, the Gemara uses the language of the Mishnah, which is, the Pasuk uses the language, Shivas Yom, Zanyam, Avla Achar Achad, but after Yom Tov is over, Eloi Sasila, if the guy doesn't take down the sukkah, have a chazaka, it's a chazaka, Mekan Ve'ela from here going forward. Why? Why is this guy living up his sukkah longer than most of the people? Everybody else took a sukkah down. Why is this guy still there? If it not whether for the fact that he wants to have it to prove that he owns it. Even though if it was in the middle of Cheshvan or in the middle of when the sun's out, it would take 30 days. But shiny hasam over here, the case of sukkahs is different. To be kara daited itself davar rishus. Over there, when a guy put up the beam stam for shade in the middle of the summer, you can see clearly the guy's using it for shade, and therefore savaloi, and therefore he saval means like he's okay handling it. The guy has his beams there. And it's the ordinary way that a person forgives, and to bear it until 30 days. But over here, because the mitzvah is over, it's clear that he's leaving it up because of chazaka, and therefore the guy must protest right away. In other words, so long as the point is like this, the person who put up the shade has to demonstrate that he's doing it for the sake of chazaka. If he's, and ordinarily it takes 30 days to prove that. But with sukkahs, as soon as sukkahs is over, it proves they're doing it for chazaka. And therefore the owner of the wall has to protest right away. Okay. Now, if he,
as soon as it's demonstrated that he's doing it for chazaka,
for ownership,
then if there's no protest, then it's a mechila.
Then going back to the goyim, it's mechila, or going back to Rashi or whoever, you can have a time that you own it,
Right.
or going to Rabbi Tam and the Rosh, it shows that you paid for the second half above the 4 amas, whatever the case is in that situation. The 8 different ways of explaining it. Okay. If you put cement on these beams, right away it's a chazaka, because the owner did not protest. This isn't something that you can't forgive. Stam guys cementing up my wall, putting up a beam, no. But cementing a wall, this is already too much. Okay. I have to think of, like I'm thinking of my neighbors, and I could see my neighbor leaning something on my wall that I have between me and him for years, and I would never care.
Right.
It doesn't mean I want to own half the wall. The Jews, we do split the. Anyway, and I'm just thinking about it.
I think it was different.
Like, in other words, we have understand that the Chacham have to make a universal standard, but does a universal standard take into consideration? Let's look at their relationship. Were they the kind of relationship that they didn't care? That has to exist, I assume. That if we know that this is two brothers, they're constantly walking in and out of each other's homes, So I left a chair in his backyard. And he now owns it now? I mean, like we were constantly hanging out in each other's yards, right? Because we're neighbors and we're brothers. Right? Is that taken into consideration? I wonder. I should probably look up in Rambam. I'm sure it's there.
Yeah.
Anyway, next Shabbat tomorrow night we're going to look at the Ramban and the Ravid, and some more ways of learning the Gemara are going to be introduced.
Should I leave this here?
Yeah, leave it there. Yeah. All right.